Strange things happened during the night shift at Walmart. The cold fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the cavernous aisles of the Walmart store. It was 11:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the night shift officially began, and Hannah's footsteps echoed eerily against the polished floors as she made her way to the staff room. The store was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional creak from the building settling. She wasn't new to night shifts, but this was her first one at this particular Walmart. Hannah had recently transferred from another location, desperate for a change after her old store had been shuttered due to poor management. As she pushed open the door to the staff room, she was greeted by the sight of three other employees. Marcus, a lanky guy with a nervous energy, Joanne, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, and Tim, the shift manager, who looked as though he hadn't slept in days. Tim glanced at her as she entered. "Hannah, right? Welcome to the team. I'll keep it simple. Stick to your assigned section. Don't wander off. And most importantly, follow the rules." "The rules?" Hannah asked, raising an eyebrow. Joanne smirked, but said nothing, while Marcus fidgeted with his lanyard. Tim's expression hardened. "You'll find a list in your locker. Read them carefully and don't break them." "Got it." Hannah nodded, a flicker of unease settling in her chest. Rules for a night shift at Walmart. It seemed unnecessary, but she decided not to question it. After all, she needed this job. Hannah's locker was at the far end of the row, and as she opened it, a neatly folded sheet of paper fell to the floor. She picked it up and unfolded it, her eyes scanning the typewritten text. Rules for the night shift. Number 1. Do not enter the toy aisle between 12 a.m. and 3 a.m. Number 2. If you hear whistling, do not investigate. Return to the staff room immediately. Number 3. Avoid looking directly at the security cameras for extended periods. Number 4. If you see a child wandering the aisles alone, notify Tim immediately. Do not approach them. Number 5. Under no circumstances should you go to the stockroom alone after 1 a.m. Hannah frowned. The rules were bizarre, almost like something out of a bad urban legend. She glanced around the staff room, half expecting someone to jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" But Joanne and Marcus were already heading to their respective sections, and Tim was busy checking his clipboard. Hannah's assigned section was the home goods aisle. It was uneventful at first as she organized throw pillows and folded towels, the monotony broken only by the occasional announcement over the PA system. Midnight came and went without incident, but as the clock ticked past 12:30, Hannah began to feel a strange sense of unease. It started with the sound of soft, melodic whistling. She froze, her heart pounding as the eerie tune drifted through the aisles. Remembering the second rule, she quickly abandoned her cart and made her way back to the staff room. Her pace quickened as the whistling grew louder, seeming to follow her. When she burst into the staff room, Tim looked up sharply. "What happened?" "I heard whistling," she said, trying to catch her breath. Tim's face darkened. "Stay here. I'll check it out." Joanne glanced at Hannah as Tim left. "You'll get used to it," she said cryptically, sipping her coffee. "What does that mean?" Hannah demanded. Joanne shrugged. "It's just one of those things that happen around here. Best not to think too hard about it." Tim returned a few minutes later, his expression grim. "It's clear now. Get back to work," he said curtly. Hannah wanted to ask more, but the look in his eyes silenced her. She returned to her section, trying to shake off the lingering unease. But as the night wore on, the sense of something being not quite right only grew stronger. Around 1:15 a.m., Hannah's curiosity got the better of her. She decided to take a detour past the toy aisle on her way to the restroom. The rules specifically forbade entering the aisle, but surely just walking by wouldn't hurt. As she approached, a cold draft seemed to emanate from the brightly colored shelves. To her surprise, the aisle appeared empty. But as she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. A doll on one of the shelves had turned its head to face her, its glassy eyes unblinking. Hannah stumbled back, her breath hitching. She blinked, and the doll's head was back in its original position. "Just my imagination," she muttered, but she hurried away nonetheless. By 2 a.m., the store seemed to take on a life of its own. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, and the air grew heavy with an unplaceable tension. Hannah was stacking boxes of scented candles when she heard the faint sound of laughter, a child's laughter. Her blood ran cold as she remembered the fourth rule. She turned slowly, and at the far end of the aisle, a small figure stood silhouetted against the light. It was a little boy, no older than 7, with tousled hair and a striped pajama set. He stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Hannah's first instinct was to approach him, but the warning in the rules stopped her. She pulled out her walkie-talkie and called Tim. "There's a child in aisle 7, she whispered, her voice trembling. "Stay where you are. I'll be there in a minute." Tim's voice crackled through the speaker. Hannah kept her eyes on the boy, but as she waited, he began to smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was too wide, too toothy, and filled with an unnatural glee. Then, without warning, he turned and ran down the aisle, disappearing around the corner. Tim arrived moments later, his face pale. "Where'd he go?" "He ran that way," Hannah said, pointing. Tim hesitated, then shook his head. "We'll check the security footage later. For now, just stick to your section." Hannah tried to focus on her work, but the night seemed to stretch on endlessly. By the time 3 a.m. rolled around, she was counting down the minutes until her shift ended. But her relief was short-lived when Marcus came running into the staff room, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "It's in the stockroom," he gasped. "I saw it." "Saw what?" Tim demanded. Marcus shook his head frantically. "I don't know what it is, but it's not human." The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on them. Tim grabbed a flashlight and motioned for Joanne to follow him. "Stay here," he told Hannah and Marcus before disappearing down the corridor. Hannah's heart pounded as she and Marcus waited in tense silence. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and then the lights flickered again. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the empty store, followed by a low, guttural growl. "What was that?" Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus didn't respond, his wide eyes fixed on the doorway. And then, as the growling grew louder, the lights went out entirely, plunging them into darkness. The oppressive silence that followed the blackout was almost unbearable. Hannah's breath hitched, her senses straining to catch the faintest sound. Next to her, Marcus trembled, clutching his flashlight like a lifeline. The beam flickered as he turned it on, casting jagged shadows across the walls of the staff room. "What's going on?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," Hannah replied, her voice shaking. "But I don't think we're alone." The guttural growl echoed again, closer this time, vibrating through the walls. The flashlight beam trembled as Marcus aimed it toward the door. The silence shattered with a loud crash from somewhere deep in the store, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. "We need to get out of here," Marcus hissed, his panic mounting. But before they could move, the staff room door creaked open. A cold breeze swept in, and in the dim light, Hannah could see a figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't Tim or Joanne. The figure was tall, with unnaturally long limbs and a head that tilted unnaturally to one side. Its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that pierced through the darkness. Hannah and Marcus froze, neither daring to breathe. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it were being controlled by invisible strings. Marcus fumbled with his flashlight, accidentally dropping it. The beam spun wildly, illuminating the figure's face for a brief moment. Its features were grotesque. Its skin stretched too tightly over its skull, and its mouth was filled with jagged, mismatched teeth. The creature let out a low, guttural laugh that sent shivers down Hannah's spine. "Run," she whispered, grabbing Marcus's arm. They bolted through the back door of the staff room, the flashlight abandoned on the floor. The creature's footsteps thundered behind them as they darted into the labyrinth of aisles. The store, which had seemed expansive and orderly before, now felt like a twisting maze designed to trap them. As they ran, the overhead lights flickered sporadically, providing brief glimpses of the store around them. The once familiar shelves now appeared distorted, the products twisted and grotesque. Hannah's chest burned with every breath, but she didn't dare stop. "This way," Marcus shouted, pointing toward the electronics section. They skidded to a halt behind a row of TVs, crouching low and trying to quiet their ragged breathing. The sound of the creature's footsteps grew fainter, but the tension remained thick in the air. "Do you think it's gone?" Marcus whispered. Hannah shook her head, her eyes scanning the darkness. I don't think it leaves. Suddenly, one of the TVs turned on with a loud static crackle. The screen glowed faintly, and an image began to form. It was the toy aisle. The camera feed was grainy, but it clearly showed the shelves lined with dolls and action figures. In the center of the screen, the little boy from earlier stood motionless, staring directly into the camera. His wide, toothy grin sent a chill down Hannah's spine. He raised a hand and pointed straight at them. The TV shut off, plunging them back into darkness. Did that just happen? Marcus asked, his voice trembling. Hannah didn't respond. Her heart pounded as she tried to make sense of what she'd seen. The rules. She'd broken the rules. Was this all happening because she'd gone near the toy aisle? We need to find Tim, she said finally. He'll know what to do. Marcus hesitated, but the growing sound of footsteps behind them left him no choice. They crept through the aisles, moving as quietly as possible. The air grew colder with every step, and Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they rounded a corner, they nearly collided with Joanne. She looked disheveled, her face pale and her hands trembling. What are you two doing? She demanded in a harsh whisper. There's something in here, Marcus said. It's hunting us. Joanne's expression darkened. I told him we shouldn't be here tonight. This place is... She stopped abruptly, her eyes darting to the shadows behind them. What? Hannah asked, her voice rising in panic. Don't move, Joanne whispered. Hannah turned her head slightly and saw it. A pair of glowing yellow eyes peering at them from the darkness. The creature was back, its misshapen form barely visible in the flickering light. It let out a low growl, and Hannah felt her stomach drop. Joanne grabbed their arms and pulled them into a narrow corridor between the shelves. This way, she hissed. The break room has a safe spot. A safe spot? Marcus asked, his voice breaking. What does that even mean? Just trust me. Joanne snapped. They ran down the corridor, the creature's guttural growls echoing behind them. Hannah's legs burned as they pushed forward, the rows of shelves blurring together. Finally, they reached a heavy steel door marked Employees Only. Joanne punched in a code on the keypad, and the door clicked open. They stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind them. The room was small and dimly lit, with reinforced walls and no windows. What is this place? Hannah asked, her breath hitching. It's where we go when things get bad, Joanne said, leaning against the wall. I told him we needed more people on shift tonight, but he didn't listen. More people wouldn't help, Marcus muttered. Not against it. Hannah looked around the room, her mind racing. What is that thing? And what's wrong with this store? Joanne hesitated, then sighed. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me, Hannah said, her voice firm. Joanne rubbed her temples, choosing her words carefully. This store, it's old. Older than it should be. They built it over something. A burial ground, a ritual site, who knows? Weird things have always happened here, but lately, it's gotten worse. Worse how? Marcus asked. Joanne didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to the security monitors in the corner of the room. The screens flickered, showing various parts of the store. In every feed, the little boy appeared, standing perfectly still and staring at the camera. As they watched, the boy slowly raised a hand and pointed. One by one, the cameras went dark. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Hannah's mind raced as she tried to process everything. The rules, the boy, the creature. It all felt like a twisted nightmare. But this was no dream. What do we do now? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Joanne looked at him, her expression grim. We survive until morning. The lights flickered again, and the guttural growl returned, louder and closer than ever. Something heavy slammed against the steel door, causing it to rattle in its frame. Brace yourselves, Joanne said, her voice steady but her eyes filled with fear. It's not done with us yet. The staff room plunged into silence as the overhead lights went out. The only sound was the faint hum of emergency lighting activating in dim corners of the store, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Hannah's breath came in short gasps as she clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Stay calm, Marcus whispered, though his trembling voice betrayed his own fear. Tim and Joanne will handle it. The growling grew louder, reverberating through the store like the low rumble of distant thunder. It was coming closer, Hannah glanced at Marcus. We can't just sit here. What if they need help? Marcus shook his head frantically. No, the rules. Tim said to stay here. To hell with the rules. Hannah snapped, adrenaline overriding her fear. She grabbed the flashlight Tim had left on the table and cautiously approached the doorway. Hannah, don't. Marcus hissed, but she ignored him. As she stepped into the corridor, the growling ceased, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The flashlight's beams sliced through the darkness, revealing the long, empty aisles of the store. Hannah's heart raced as she crept forward, her sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor. Tim, Joanne, she called out in a low voice, her words swallowed by the void. Her footsteps led her toward the stockroom, the very place the rules had warned against after 1 a.m. She hesitated at the double doors, her mind replaying Marcus's panicked words. It's in the stockroom. I saw it. Summoning every ounce of courage, she pushed the door open. The stockroom was colder than the rest of the store, and the air smelled faintly of metal and damp cardboard. The flashlight beam danced across shelves piled high with boxes, casting long, angular shadows that seemed to shift and twist as she moved. Tim, Joanne, she called again, her voice trembling. A faint sound reached her ears, a soft scraping, like nails dragging across metal. The beam of her flashlight swung toward the source, but the shelves ahead were empty. She took a cautious step forward, and then another, the scraping growing louder with each step. As she rounded a corner, her flashlight illuminated a figure crouched in the far corner of the room. It was Joanne, her back to Hannah, her shoulders heaving as though she were sobbing. Joanne. Hannah whispered, relief flooding her. She took a step closer. Are you okay? Joanne didn't respond. Hannah hesitated, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Something was wrong. Joanne's movements were jerky, unnatural, as if she were being manipulated like a marionette. And then she turned. Hannah's scream caught her throat. Joanne's face was pale, her eyes sunken and lifeless. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing rows of jagged, impossibly sharp teeth. You shouldn't be here, Joanne said, her voice distorted and echoing, as though it came from somewhere deep within the room. Hannah stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. Darkness enveloped her, and the sound of Joanne's laughter filled the air, a chilling, inhuman cackle that sent shivers down her spine. She scrambled to retrieve the flashlight, her hands shaking. When she finally managed to turn it back on, Joanne was gone. Hannah bolted out of the stockroom, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't stop until she reached the staff room, slamming the door behind her. Marcus jumped to his feet, his eyes wide. What happened? Where's Tim and Joanne? Hannah could barely catch her breath. Joanne, she's not normal. Something's wrong. Marcus paled. I told you not to go. Before Hannah could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed outside the staff room. They were slow, deliberate, and accompanied by the same low growl they'd heard earlier. It's here, Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. The doorknob rattled. Hannah and Marcus backed away from the door as it creaked open. The emergency lights flickered, casting fleeting shadows on the figure that stepped inside. It wasn't Tim or Joanne. It wasn't human. The creature was tall, its limbs impossibly long and bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale and mottled, like something that had never seen the light of day. Glowing yellow eyes pierced the darkness, locking onto Hannah and Marcus with predatory intent. Run, Marcus shouted, grabbing Hannah's arm and yanking her toward the back exit. They sprinted through the darkened store, the creature's guttural growl and heavy footsteps close behind. Hannah's lungs burned as she pushed herself to run faster, weaving through the aisles and knocking over displays in a desperate attempt to slow it down. Over here, Marcus shouted, leading her toward the garden center. The glass doors loomed ahead, their panes reflecting the faint glow of the parking lot lights. Freedom was so close. As they reached the doors, Marcus shoved them open, and the cold night air rushed over them. They stumbled outside, their breath visible in the chilly air. But when they turned to look back, the creature was gone. What was that? Hannah gasped, doubling over to catch her breath. Marcus shook his head, his eyes wide with terror. I don't know, but I'm never coming back here. Hannah glanced back at the store. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, leaving the building shrouded in darkness. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Hannah and Marcus sat on the curb, waiting for the morning shift to arrive. The terror of the night lingered, a weight they couldn't shake. When the store manager pulled into the parking lot, Hannah and Marcus didn't wait to explain. They stood up, walked to their cars, and drove away, vowing never to return. But as Hannah looked in her rearview mirror, she thought she saw something move in the shadows of the store. Something watching, waiting.